Most people think a debate is decided by who has the better argument, who talks faster, who remembers more facts, who has the sharper comeback. But here's what makes most people lose before the debate even really starts. They walk into it feeling threatened. They don't enter the conversation trying to clarify the truth. They enter trying to defend themselves. And the moment that happens, the balance has already shifted. You've probably felt this before. Someone says one thing that rubs you the wrong way. You instantly heat up. Your heart starts beating faster. You start explaining. You talk quicker than usual. You try to correct what they just pinned on you. And little by little, the conversation drifts further and further away from the real point. Then it ends. And you walk away feeling angry, frustrated, and strangely powerless. And a few hours later, the perfect response finally hits you. Not because you're stupid, not because you lacked logic, but because in that moment, you got pulled into reaction mode. And that's the real truth. In a lot of arguments, the winner is not the person who is most right. It's not the person who talks the most either. It's the person who keeps their rhythm longer, keeps their head cooler, and refuses to get dragged into the role of someone begging to be understood. Once you understand that, the way you argue changes completely. You stop seeing debate as a battle of volume. You start seeing it for what it really is. A game of frame, a game of timing, a game of position, a game of clarity. If you've ever walked out of an argument and only thought of the right thing to say hours later, comment one below. That's not a sign that you're weak. It's just a sign that you haven't learned how to hold yourself when pressure rises. The biggest mistake most people make is trying to prove they're right too early. This is where a lot of people lose control without realizing it. The second someone pushes back on you, your natural instinct is to explain yourself right away. No, that's not what I meant. Let me clarify. You misunderstood me. What I was actually saying is, sounds reasonable, right? But a lot of the time, that desperate need to fix how you're being seen is exactly what makes you lose power in the conversation. Why? Because the moment you get anxious about being understood correctly, you've already handed the other person the higher position. Now they become the one judging, and you become the one chasing after your image, trying to save it. That role reversal is dangerous, and most people can feel it before they can even explain it. They sense your urgency. They sense that you need their approval. They sense that you're afraid of being seen the wrong way. And from that point on, they start controlling the pace of the conversation. Think about it. In a meeting, two people get challenged. One starts talking immediately. They pour out explanation after explanation. The longer they talk, the more obvious it becomes that they're rattled. The other person pauses for a second, looks up, chooses one short sentence, separates the issue clearly. You already know who carries more weight. Not because the second person is automatically smarter, but because they didn't let themselves get dragged into a position where they had to prove their value on the spot. A lot of people don't lose arguments because they lack logic. They lose because they need validation too badly. And the more badly you need validation, the more rushed you become. The more rushed you become, the more you talk. The more you talk, the more openings you create for the other person to pick you apart. And that's where everything starts turning against you. Because people who are truly good at arguing do not begin with attack. They begin by holding the frame. One of the strongest ways to do that is selective agreement. It sounds backward at first. A lot of people think that if you agree with the other person, you're losing. But no. Used the right way, agreement is not surrender. It's a way to break the conflict pattern at its root. When someone is gearing up to attack you, what they expect most is defensive energy. They expect pushback. They expect escalation. But if instead of snapping back, you acknowledge the part they got right, you do something powerful. You cut off the momentum of their attack. For example, someone says, "This idea sounds completely unrealistic." An insecure person will fire back instantly. "No, it's not. You just don't understand it yet." And now the fight begins. But someone more grounded might say, "Fair. From that angle, it does sound unrealistic. But there are actually two different issues getting mixed together here." That's it. And suddenly the entire tone changes. You didn't deny everything. You didn't corner yourself. You acknowledged the reasonable part of what they said, then took back the right to define the real issue. That skill is incredibly powerful in real life because it does three things at once. First, it makes you look calm. Second, it lowers the other person's attack energy. Third, it pulls the conversation out of emotion and back into structure. And here's the truth most people miss. The person who controls the structure usually controls the outcome. But selective agreement does not mean weakness. In fact, it takes far more strength than attacking back. Because attacking is instinct. Agreeing in the right place is a conscious choice. It requires enough inner stability that you don't feel smaller just because you admitted the other person got one part right. Weak people are scared to agree because they think every step back is a loss. Strong people know that admitting what is true does not make them smaller. It just makes the conversation clearer. Then comes the second move. And this is the move a lot of highly skilled communicators use all the time. They use questions to make the other person expose their own gaps. They don't need to say, "You're wrong." They don't need to lecture. They don't need to act superior. They just ask the right question. Because sometimes one good question is stronger than 10 confident statements. Statements make people defensive. Questions make people step inside their own logic. Let's say someone says, "People who do well in school always end up more successful." If you push back immediately, it usually turns into a verbal fight. But if you ask, "What exactly do you mean by success?" Or, "Do you think academic performance automatically creates real-world capability?" Now they have to pause. Now they have to define something they were tossing around like it was obvious. And a lot of the time, that's the exact moment people realize their argument was way too shallow. Weak people rush to conclusions. Strong people ask the right questions. And a good question does something beautiful. It doesn't crush the other person. It makes them see the weakness in their own position. And when people see the weakness themselves, they become far less defensive than when you point at it directly. That's why the strongest people in conversation are not always the ones with the most aggressive lines. A lot of the time, they're the ones who ask the question that quietly changes the entire room. 3 kinds of questions are especially powerful. What makes you so sure of that? What evidence are you basing that on? If the situation changed, would this argument still hold up? Each one pulls the other person out of emotional certainty and forces them onto firmer ground. If they have real substance, the conversation gets deeper. If they don't, the weakness shows itself without you needing to raise your voice. If you're starting to realize that debate is really a game of frame and questions, not volume, comment 1 below, because just seeing that already puts you ahead of a lot of people. Now let's talk about something that looks small, but changes your position completely. Language. The exact same idea can place you as an equal, as someone lower, or as someone higher in the conversation depending on how you phrase it. A lot of people don't lose on content. They lose in delivery. They use words that weaken their own position, while also triggering conflict they never needed. For example, when you say, "You're being irrational," you're not just challenging the argument, you're labeling the person. And the second a person feels labeled, they almost always go into defense mode. Or when you say, "That's not what I meant, let me explain." Even if you don't mean it that way, it still carries the energy of someone rushing to save their image. It sounds like you're asking for permission to be understood correctly. So change the language, not to manipulate, but to stay precise and keep your position. Instead of saying, "You're being irrational," say, "That point doesn't address the core issue." Instead of, "You misunderstood me," say, "We're talking about 2 different things." Instead of, "That's not what I meant, let me explain," say, "That's not the point I'm making." Feel the difference. One is defensive, the other reframes the conversation. And that is the real difference. People with less presence use words to dump emotion. People with weight use words to clarify reality. They don't need to overpower anyone. They just need to be precise enough not to get dragged off course. And that precision creates authority. Because people are not just listening to what you say, they're listening to the state behind your words. When your sentences are shorter, cleaner, and less apologetic, you sound like someone who is standing firmly on their own feet. Now here's a place where a lot of advice online gets it wrong. Data. People love to say that if you want to win an argument, you should throw out more information. Overwhelm them with facts. Hit them with endless stats and references. Sounds powerful, but in reality, this is exactly what makes a lot of people look panicked. Because dumping too much scattered information does not create strength, it creates noise. And a lot of the time, the person unloading endless evidence is the one trying to compensate for not having a clear argument in the first place. Strong people do not use more. They use what matters more precisely. Instead of throwing out a mess of facts, they use 3 clean moves. 1 fact, 1 example, 1 conclusion. That's it. Clean, clear, hard to dodge. Instead of rambling through endless studies, market trends, expert opinions, customer reactions, and random numbers, you can simply say, there are 3 problems with that idea. First, the current evidence doesn't support it. Second, in real situations, it creates the opposite result. Third, your logic doesn't stay consistent when applied to another case. That sounds completely different, doesn't it? It has structure, it has rhythm, it has weight. The rule of 3 is not some magic trick. It works because the brain likes completion. 1 point can feel thin, 2 points can feel unfinished, 3 points feel solid, serious, and thought through. But the real key is not just forcing yourself to say 3 things. The key is making sure each one does a different job. 1 fact anchors reality. 1 example makes it real. 1 conclusion locks in the meaning. When you do that, you don't need to talk more to sound more prepared. And this is where many people get trapped. They think that to win, they need to leave the other person speechless. So, they start hunting for savage comebacks, humiliating lines, those sharp little remarks that sound satisfying in the moment. But the more mature you become, the more you realize something cold and important. The strongest closing line is not the one that embarrasses the other person most. It's the one that closes the frame without dragging you down into their level of chaos. A line like, "That's great advice from someone who's never actually done this," might sound sharp. But most of the time, it just turns the conversation into a personal attack. Now you've given them a reason to get emotional, get louder, and pull the whole exchange into a mess. Someone with more control uses lines that are colder, shorter, and much harder to escape, like, "You're avoiding the main point." That sounds strong, but it still doesn't answer the question. You're arguing against something I never said. If we take emotion out of it, what's the actual logic here? These lines have a special kind of power. They do not try to wound. They do not try to impress. They simply put the light back where it belongs. And once the light returns to the real issue, a lot of people lose their footing on their own, because now it becomes obvious that they're saying a lot without touching the core. That is what a real finishing move looks like. Not humiliation, frame control. Think about it. Some people talk and talk and talk, loud, long, confident. But the more they speak, the farther they drift from the actual point. In that moment, the strongest person is not the louder one. It's the one calm enough to say 1 sentence like a thin blade. Everything you just said still doesn't answer the original point. That's it. And suddenly the energy in the room changes, because everyone realizes there is still one person here who hasn't lost the thread. Now, put all of this together, and the full picture becomes much clearer. When you face an argument, the first move is not finding the sharpest line. The first move is making sure you do not fall into self-defense mode. Then, if needed, you acknowledge the part that is true to break the fight pattern. Then you ask questions that pull the logic into the light. You use precise language to hold your position. You speak briefly with structure. And if the conversation starts drifting, you use 1 closing line to bring it back to the core. That's why the same person can seem like 2 completely different people in different moments. Sometimes they are sharp, calm, concise, powerful. Other times they are rushed, wordy, and easy to throw off. The difference is not just intelligence, it's inner state. When you are calmer, you hear more clearly. When you hear more clearly, you see the frame. When you see the frame, you know what to say. And even more importantly, you know what not to say. And here's the deeper layer. Some arguments do not need to be won. Some people are not worth the energy it takes to prove anything to them. Some situations reach a point where the strongest move is to stop. Not because you ran out of logic, but because you are clear enough to see that truth is no longer being pursued. At that point, it's just ego wrestling with ego. A mature person does not measure their worth by winning against everybody. They measure it by how much of themselves they can still keep in the moments most likely to make them lose themselves. And this is where a lot of people wake up too late. They think the goal is to become unbeatable in every argument. But if you go far enough, you realize the real goal is higher than that. Not to win every argument, but to stop being dragged around by every argument. Because once you stop getting dragged around, you've gained something most people never truly touch: self-control under pressure. Amateurs enter arguments trying to beat the other person. Wise people enter trying to hold their position. Strong people enter with the ability to say what needs to be said, see clearly what is actually happening, and walk away at the right moment if the conversation is no longer worth having. That is a completely different level. It's not loud, it's not performative, but anyone who has ever been around a person like that can feel their weight. So in your next conversation, don't try to say the smartest thing in the room. Don't go searching for the comeback that will shut the other person down. Just do one thing first. Slow down for 2 seconds before you respond. 2 seconds is tiny, but that tiny gap is the line between reaction and choice, between being pulled and holding yourself, between someone defending themselves and someone truly leading the conversation. You do not need to be the fastest talker in the room to do this. You do not need to memorize 100 communication tricks. You just need to start building a different kind of strength. The strength not to react immediately, because everything else starts there. The right question, the right closing line, the right words, the right timing, the right position. All of it begins the moment you stop letting emotion run ahead of you. And that is exactly what separates people with real weight from people who are only trying to sound sharp. Someone trying to sound sharp usually makes the room heavier. Someone with real weight makes the truth easier to see. They don't need to make anybody smaller in order to feel bigger. They just stay grounded enough not to get pushed off their own center. So pick just one seat from this video and use it in your very next conversation. Maybe it's the 2-second pause. Maybe it's replacing one defensive line with a framing line. Maybe it's asking one question that forces the other person to clap. Don't try to do everything at once. Just pick one. But practice it for real, because knowing without using changes nothing. And once you start using it, you'll notice the first thing that changes is not other people. It's your own state. And when your state changes, the way people treat you changes too. They stop underestimating you so easily. They stop testing how far they can push you. They stop using noise to overpower you, not because you became more aggressive, but because you stopped giving off the signal of someone who can be easily pulled off center. And if you want to keep learning the kind of skills that make your words carry more weight, help you hold stronger boundaries, and make you feel more grounded in every conversation you walk into, subscribe to the channel, because some of the biggest changes in your life do not begin with anything dramatic. They begin the moment you stop losing yourself in the smallest moments. And sometimes, learning how to argue the right way doesn't just change how you speak, it changes how you live.